The candlelight inside the Granville ballroom was kind to everyone except Elena Gray. She stood at the very edge of the dance floor, half hidden by a velvet curtain the color of old wine, her back pressed against the cool wall as if she might melt into the plaster. Her gown, a soft dove gray that had been her cousin, before it was hers, whispered of poverty in a room that shouted silk and diamonds. No one looked at her. That was not unusual. What was unusual was the sharp, unexpected crack of a voice she had trained herself to listen for, even across crowded rooms. The Duke of Ashford was standing not 10 feet away, his broad shoulders half-turned so that the candlelight caught the severe line of his jaw and the cool, unreadable darkness of his eyes. His companion, Lord Julian Blackwood, had just made some light remark about the crush of guests, and the Duke's response drifted to Elena's ears with all the casual cruelty of a man who did not realize anyone worth noticing might overhear. "I have little patience for wallflowers who clutter the edges of ballrooms, Blackwood. If they cannot bear to dance, they should stay at home and spare the rest of us their silent reproaches." The words settled into Elena's chest like small, precise stones. Her fingers went cold inside her gloves. She had spent the previous year quietly, desperately, adoring this man from a distance that now felt immeasurable. She had listened to the low timbre of his voice in drawing rooms, catalogued the rare, fleeting half-smiles he offered to politicians and widows, imagined in her most secret hours that his sternness concealed something deep and loyal. And all the while she had been nothing to him, less than nothing, a piece of furniture to be dismissed. Elena did not cry. She had learned years ago, when her parents died, and she became the poor ward of her wealthy aunt, that tears brought nothing but contempt. Instead, she drew a breath that tasted of waxen lilies, and she stepped back into the shadow of the curtain until her shoulder blades touched the wall. She did not move for an hour. When the carriage finally carried her home in the early hours of the morning, Elena stared at the sleeping city and made a quiet promise to herself. She would never again let anyone see the vulnerable, hopping girl she had been. She would become a woman who did not need to be seen, and she would make that her armor. 3 days later, her cousin Lady Catherine Penwood burst into their shared sitting room with a flurry of excited hands and a letter edged in gold. "Ellie, you will never guess. The Dowager Duchess of Ashford has invited us to a fortnight's gathering at Ashford Hall, a winter house party. There will be skating and fires and a grand ball on the final evening. Mamma says I am to have a new gown, and you must come as my companion, of course. Oh, say you are pleased." Elena's heart performed a treacherous little leap before she crushed it firmly. Ashford Hall, that meant the Duke. That meant days and nights under the same roof as the man who had called her a silent reproach to be avoided. She arranged her features into a calm, gentle smile and agreed that it sounded delightful. She was very good at that. The journey to the Cotswolds took the better part of a day. Catherine chattered about the prospects of the party, about which eligible gentlemen might attend, about the color of her new satin slippers. Elena nodded at appropriate intervals and watched the winter landscape unroll like a silver tapestry beyond the carriage window. Inside, she was bracing herself, brick by brick, against the moment she would see the Duke again. Ashford Hall rose from the frosted countryside like a great stone ship anchored in a sea of white. Its towers and gables were dusted with snow, and smoke curled from a dozen chimneys into a pale pewter sky. When the carriage pulled into the courtyard, liveried servants rushed forward with blankets and hot bricks, and Elena stepped down into air so cold it made her teeth ache. The Duke himself stood at the top of the stone steps, greeting his guests. As Catherine ascended, offering him a radiant smile, Elena kept her eyes lowered and curtsied as shallowly as politeness allowed. She felt his gaze slide over her without stopping, exactly as it had at the Granville ball. This time she did not flinch. Over the following days, Elena made herself quietly useful. She arranged Catherine's hair, mended a torn hem, wrote letters for her aunt, and otherwise became a soft presence that drew no notice. She took her breakfast early and her tea late. She walked the long gallery in the pale morning hours when no one else was stirring, studying the portraits of generations of Ashfords with their stern mouths and heavy-lidded eyes. She found a particular comfort in the library, a soaring 2-story room lined with leather-bound volumes and smelling of wood smoke and old paper. It was there, on the 4th afternoon of the party, that her careful invisibility failed. Elena was curled in a deep window seat, a book of Shakespeare's sonnets open in her lap, when the heavy door swung open and the Duke of Ashford strode in. He stopped when he saw her, his dark brows drawing together. She rose at once, closing the book and curtsying. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not think anyone would be using the library at this hour. I shall leave you to your privacy." "Stay," he said. The word was not warm, merely economical. He crossed to the fireplace and held his hands toward the flames. "I dislike the thought that I have chased a guest from a room. Please sit." Elena hesitated, then settled back onto the window seat, her heart tapping a warning against her ribs. She opened the book again, but the words blurred. The Duke did not look at her. He stared into the fire for a long moment, and then, quite unexpectedly, spoke. Shakespeare's sonnets, an unusual choice for a young lady. Are you not fond of novels and fashion plates? The question was so close to the unkindness she had overheard that Elena's throat tightened, but her voice, when it came, was even. I enjoy novels, Your Grace. I also enjoy poetry. The sonnets in particular speak of matters that fashion plates do not address. He turned his head slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his angular features. Such as longing, Elena said quietly, and the fear of being forgotten. For a heartbeat there was silence. The Duke studied her as if seeing her for the first time. That is a heavy subject for a house party. It is a heavy subject for a life, she replied, but I meant no impertinence, Your Grace. You did not give impertinence. You gave an honest answer. He moved a step closer. I have noticed you, Miss Grey. You are Lady Catherine's companion, are you not? You move about this house so quietly I find myself forgetting you are here, and then I turn a corner and you are reading something profound in a window seat. It is disconcerting. Elena's fingers tightened on the book. She did not know whether to be insulted or gratified that he had noticed her after all. I apologize for being disconcerting. I shall endeavor to be more predictable. Her astonishment, the corner of his mouth twitched. It was not a smile, not quite, but the possibility of one. That is the second honest answer you have given me. You are a rare creature, Miss Grey. I am a wallflower, Your Grace, she said, and the word tasted of bravery and old hurt. We are not rare, we are merely quiet. Something shifted in his expression, a shadow of recognition or perhaps the beginning of discomfort. But before he could respond, the door opened and Catherine swept in, her cheeks pink from a brisk walk, and the moment shattered like thin ice. After that day, Elena noticed a change. The Duke did not seek her out, but neither did he ignore her. At dinner that evening, his gaze drifted to her end of the table once, twice, a third time. When she made a remark about the architecture of the hall, quoting something she had read, he leaned forward slightly and asked a follow-up question that proved he had been listening. Catherine was delighted, chattering about how kind His Grace was to take an interest in her dear companion. Elena was not so certain it was kindness. It felt more like a scientist examining a specimen that had unexpectedly proven interesting. 2 days later, a group of guests braved the frozen lake for skating. Elena stood at the edge of the ice in her plain wool cloak, watching the bright, bundled figures glide and spin. The Duke was among them, his movements powerful and assured. Lady Isabel Harrington, the woman widely rumored to be his future Duchess, skated at his side, her golden hair spilling from a fur-trimmed hood, her laughter ringing like a bell. They made a beautiful pair, polished and unapproachable. Elena turned away and walked along the snowy path that skirted the lake, her boots crunching in the stillness. She had not gone far when she heard a crack, a terrified shriek, and the sound of splintering ice. She whirled around. A small group had ventured too near the far bank, and a section of ice had given way. Catherine's bright scarlet cloak was unmistakable among them, and Elena's blood turned to ice. She ran. By the time she reached the scene, Lord Blackwood and a groom had pulled Catherine from the freezing water. Catherine was shaking, her lips blue, but alive. The Duke was dragging a second guest to safety, his face grim with effort. Elena dropped to her knees beside her cousin, wrapping her own cloak around Catherine's shoulders, murmuring soothing words while her hands trembled. You are safe, Catherine, you are safe. Hush now, we will get you warm. The chaos, she felt a heavy wool coat being draped over her own shoulders. She looked up and found the Duke standing above her, water streaming from his dark hair, his shirt clinging to his chest. He had given her his own outer coat, despite the cold that must have been biting his skin. Grace, you need this more than I do, she protested. You are shivering, Miss Grey. I have survived worse. See to your cousin. His voice was curt, but his eyes held something that made her breath catch. It was not curiosity this time. It was something softer, more guarded. He turned away before she could speak. That night, Elena sat by Catherine's bedside until the fire had warmed the room and the color had returned to her cousin's cheeks. Catherine, drowsy and grateful, squeezed her hand. You are so steady, Ellie. I don't know what I would do without you. Elena smoothed the coverlet and said nothing, but inside she felt a strange, quiet strength settling into her bones. She had been steady, she had been useful, and for the first time, the Duke had seen her not as a wallflower, but as someone who could act in a crisis. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. The following evening, Lady Isabel Harrington decided to host an impromptu musicale in the Grand Salon. The young ladies of the party were to display their accomplishments on the pianoforte or with song. Catherine, still recovering, was excused. Elena, seated in a corner with needlework she had no intention of completing, expected to be forgotten. But Lady Isabel, with a smile that did not quite reach her cool blue eyes, called out across the room. "Miss Grey, I understand you play beautifully. I have heard it whispered that you are quite the hidden talent. You will favor us, I am sure." Invitation was a trap. Elena had no formal training beyond what her mother had taught her as a child, and she knew her playing was unremarkable. To refuse would be rude. To accept would invite humiliation. She saw Lady Isabel's lips curve with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Elena rose, placing her needlework aside with careful dignity. "I have little talent, Lady Isabel, but I am happy to contribute if it pleases the company." She walked to the pianoforte as if approaching a guillotine. Her fingers were cold. She sat, adjusted her skirts, and began to play a simple, unadorned melody her mother had loved. She did not try to impress. She did not trill or embellish. She simply played the notes with all the tenderness the piece deserved, and when she finished, there was a brief, surprised silence. Then the Duke began to applaud. Slowly, deliberately, his gaze fixed on Elena with an intensity that made heat rise to her cheeks. The others joined in, but Elena heard only the steady rhythm of his hands coming together, a sound that felt like a declaration she did not yet understand. Lady Isabel's expression flickered, a crack in her polished surface, before she smoothed it away and praised Elena, charming simplicity. The word was meant to sting, but Elena found she did not care. She returned to her seat with her head held high, feeling the Duke's gaze follow her every step. Later that night, Elena stood alone on the terrace, wrapped in her cloak, watching snowflakes drift down from a starless sky. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. The Duke emerged from the shadows, bareheaded, his dark hair dusted with white. "You should not be out here alone, Miss Grey. You will catch a chill." "I am not afraid of the cold, Your Grace." "No," he said quietly. "I am beginning to see that you are not afraid of very much at all." She turned to face him. In the dim light, his severe features looked almost vulnerable. "You give me too much credit. I am afraid of a great many things." As she hesitated. "Being invisible," she said, and the word hung between them like a confession, "and being seen all at once." He took a step closer. "I see you," he said, and his voice was low and rough, as if the words were being dragged from a place he kept carefully locked. "I have not been able to stop seeing you since that afternoon in the library. It is an inconvenience I did not anticipate." Elena's heart beat so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "I do not wish to be an inconvenience, Your Grace." "You are not," he said, and then more softly, "You are not." They stood in the snow, the silence stretching, filled with all the things neither of them dared to say. Then he took a breath that seemed to cost him something, and he stepped back. "Good night, Miss Grey. Good night, Your Grace." She watched him disappear into the golden-lit windows of the hall, and she understood, with a clarity that hurt, that she was falling in love with a man who was all but engaged to another woman. She also understood that she would not survive it if she did not begin to pull away. The next days became a delicate dance of avoidance and near misses. Elena spent more time with Catherine, walked the gardens with Lord Blackwood, who was kind and undemanding, and excused herself from any gathering where she might be thrown too close to the Duke. He noticed. She could tell by the way his gaze followed her, by the tightening of his jaw when she laughed at something Lord Blackwood said, by the abrupt manner in which he excused himself from conversations she was near. It was jealousy, she realized with a shock. The Duke of Ashford was jealous. And then came the night of the final grand ball. Ashford Hall blazed with candlelight. Garlands of evergreen and hothouse roses draped the banisters, and the music of a string quartet floated through the open doors. Elena wore a gown of deep forest green, a hand-me-down from Catherine that had been altered to fit her. It was still too simple for the occasion, but she had pinned a sprig of holly to her bodice and decided she would not apologize for her presence. She danced with Lord Blackwood, who teased her gently and made her smile. She danced with a shy baron who stepped on her toes. And then, as the evening reached its glittering peak, the Duke himself appeared before her, his dark eyes holding a challenge. "Miss Grey, I believe this dance is mine," was not a request. Elena placed her hand in his, ignoring the jealous glances and whispered speculations that flickered through the crowd like summer lightning. They took their places for a waltz, and when his hand settled on her waist, the world around them seemed to dim. "You have been avoiding me," he said quietly. "I have been giving you the space you did not know you needed." A muscle in his jaw flexed. "And if I do not want space, if what I want is the opposite of space," her heart slammed against her ribs. "Your Grace, you are speaking in riddles." "I am speaking in the only way I know how," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have spent my life building walls, Miss Grey. I did not think there was anyone alive who could make me want to tear them down. And yet here you are, quiet and steady and so utterly yourself, and I am undone." Elena missed a step. He caught her, his grip tightening, and for a moment they were frozen in the middle of the swirling dancers, his face inches from hers. "I am not free," he said, and the words were heavy with regret. "I have obligations, expectations, a family who would never understand, and yet I cannot stop thinking about you." "Then perhaps you should stop," Elena said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "I will not be a secret, Your Grace. I will not be a woman you visit in the shadows while your Duchess waits at home. I have spent my life being invisible, and I will not be invisible in love." His expression cracked, the severe mask slipping to reveal something raw and desperate. "Elena" was the first time he had used her name. It sounded like a prayer. The music ended. She stepped back, her chest aching, and curtsied. "I wish you every happiness, Your Grace." She did not wait for his reply. She walked out of the ballroom, out into the cold, clean air, and she did not cry until she was alone in her room with the door locked. The confrontation came the next morning. Lady Isabel, elegant and cold as frosted glass, found Elena in the conservatory. Her voice was sweet, poisonous. "Miss Grey, I trust you enjoyed the ball. The Duke is an excellent dancer, is he not? I imagine he will make a fine husband once our engagement is announced." Elena kept her hands steady on the watering can she was holding. "I am sure he will, my lady. I dislike complications," Isabel continued, drifting closer, "and I have noticed that the Duke's attention has been distracted of late. I am sure a woman of your intelligence understands that these country house flirtations are meaningless. The Duke and I were meant for each other. Our families have planned it for years. A woman of your station could never be more than a passing amusement." The words landed like stones, but Elena's spine straightened. She turned to face the other woman fully, her quiet dignity and armor Isabel's venom could not pierce. "You have nothing to fear from me, Lady Isabel. I know my place. I have always known it. But I would ask you to remember that the Duke is not a possession to be guarded. He is a man, and he will choose his own heart, whatever that choice may be." She set down the watering can and walked away before Isabel could see the tremble in her hands. She did not see the Duke for the rest of that day. She was told he had ridden out alone and returned late, his face like thunder. She did not seek him out. She packed her trunk quietly, preparing for the departure scheduled in 2 days, and told herself the ache in her chest would fade with time. The crisis came that very evening. Elena was summoned to the Dowager Duchess's private sitting room, where she found the older woman, the Duke, and Lady Isabel waiting. Isabel's eyes were red as if she had been weeping, and she clutched a handkerchief with theatrical sorrow. "Miss Grey," the Dowager Duchess began, her voice icy, "a very serious accusation has been made. Lady Isabel reports that she overheard you speaking ill of this family, calling the Duke a prideful and unfeeling man, and expressing your intention to trap him into a compromising situation. What have you to say?" Elena's blood turned to ice. The lie was so audacious, so perfectly crafted to destroy her. She looked at the Duke, hopping against hope to find belief in his eyes, but his face was a cold mask, shuttered and unreadable. "The accusation is false, Your Grace," Elena said, her voice clear despite the terror clawing at her throat. "I have never spoken such words. I would never speak such words. I do not know why Lady Isabel would say this. She says it because it is true," Isabel whispered, dabbing at her eyes. "I did not wish to believe it either, but I heard her with my own ears. She was speaking to a servant, laughing about her scheme." Duke said nothing. He simply stared at Elena, and in his stare she saw every fear she had ever harbored made real. He did not believe her. The man who had said he saw her, who had looked at her as if she were the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life, did not believe her. Something inside Elena cracked, and then, quite suddenly, hardened into something unbreakable. She curtsied, very low, very formal. "I see that I have no defense against such an accusation. I will remove myself from this house at first light. I thank you for your hospitality, Your Grace, and I apologize for any distress my presence has caused." She straightened and looked the Duke directly in the eye. "I wish you well, Your Grace, truly." She walked out of the room without waiting to be dismissed. She did not weep. She did not falter. She packed her remaining belongings, sent word to Catherine that she was unwell and would travel separately, and before dawn she was in a hired carriage, the towers of Ashford Hall shrinking into the darkness behind her. The cottage where Elena sought refuge belonged to her old nurse, a woman named Mrs. Hollies, who lived in a quiet village near the Welsh border. The cottage was small and snug, its garden sleeping under a blanket of snow. Mrs. Hollies asked no questions, simply opened her arms and her door, and Elena let herself be held for the first time in weeks. She did not expect to heal quickly. She did not expect the Duke to come after her. She expected nothing but the slow, patient work of rebuilding a life that did not depend on anyone else's approval. She helped with the cooking and the mending. She read books borrowed from the village vicar. She walked the snowy lanes until her cheeks glowed and her thoughts quieted. And day by day, she felt the girl who had once longed for a duke's notice fading, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth. It was nearly a fortnight later, on a grey afternoon when the snow was beginning to melt into slush, that the carriage came. Elena was in the garden, scattering breadcrumbs for the birds, when she heard the crunch of wheels on gravel. She looked up, and her heart stopped. The Duke of Ashford stepped down from the carriage, bareheaded, his greatcoat rumpled, his face gaunt and hollowed. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. He saw her and stopped, as if he had run out of courage at the very last moment. Elena did not curtsy. She simply stood there in her plain wool dress, the breadcrumbs still clinging to her fingers, and waited. He walked toward her slowly. "Miss Grey," he said, and his voice was hoarse. "Elena, I have been a fool." She did not disagree, Isabel confessed. He continued, the words tumbling out as if he had rehearsed them 100 times and forgotten every single one. She admitted she lied. She was jealous and afraid, and she thought she could rid herself of a rival, but she could not rid me of the truth that I have been in love with you since the moment you looked up from a book of sonnets and told me you feared being invisible. I should have believed you, I should have defended you, I should have done 1,000 things, and I did none of them. He took a breath. I have broken my understanding with Lady Isabel. I have told my mother that I will marry where my heart lies or I will not marry at all. And my heart, Elena, my stubborn, misguided, late-waking heart, has been yours for longer than I was brave enough to admit. She studied him, this powerful duke who now stood before her as vulnerable as a penitent. The resentment she had carried was there, but so was the love, stubborn and enduring. She had walked away to save herself, and he had followed not to claim her but to lay his soul at her feet. "You hurt me," she said quietly. "You looked at me as if I were a stranger." "I know," his voice broke. "I will carry that regret for the rest of my life. I am asking you for something I do not deserve, a chance. One chance to prove that I see you, that I will always see you. That no social expectation, no family pressure, no fear of my own heart will ever make me blind again." Hung between them, filled with the soft drip of melting snow, Elena felt the last of the ice around her heart crack and dissolve. She had become a woman who did not need him, and perhaps that was the only reason she could now choose him freely. "I will not be a wallflower in your life, Your Grace," she said. "If I am to stand beside you, I will stand in full sunlight. I will speak my mind and read my sonnets and never apologize for being myself." His eyes, dark and desperate and shining, held hers. "I would have you no other way. I love you, Elena, not the quiet companion, not the hidden talent, not the convenient woman in the corner. You, the woman who walks out when she is wronged and feeds the birds in a cottage garden. I love you." There it was, the confession she had never dared to hope for, delivered in a voice that trembled with everything he had once kept locked away. Elena smiled, a small, tremulous thing that grew slowly into something radiant. "Then you had better come inside and have some tea. Mrs. Hollis will want to interrogate you thoroughly, and she makes very strong opinions about men who make women cry." He laughed, a sound torn between relief and joy, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. She turned and led him into the cottage, and the door closed gently behind them, shutting out the cold. Spring came to the village, and with it came a quiet wedding in a small stone church. Elena wore a gown of soft ivory, her only adornment the sprig of holly she had once pinned to her bodice, preserved and dried like a promise. The Duke's eyes, when he saw her walking down the aisle, were wet with unshed tears. And the first words he spoke, as he took her hand, were not a vow, but a whisper meant only for her. "I see you." She had once been a wallflower, a girl who faded into the edges of ballrooms, but standing in the dusty sunlight of a country church, with the Duke's hand warm and steady around hers, Elena Grey knew she had never been invisible. She had simply been waiting for the right eyes to find her, and now, at last, they had.